Our next speaker is David Friedman, who you've met already. But I'm going to, in this case, sort of break my rule about short introductions because I have some interesting stories I can tell about David. And also because David's talk is the last one today, and that leaves a lot of leeway in terms of running over. I met David, okay, well, I met David over 10 years ago, although he doesn't remember. And in fact, I bumped into him at Libertarian functions off and on over these 10 years, and he hasn't remembered any of them. And so what I've done is I've secretly designed this conference so that in the future he will never forget me. And for instance, just one part of my plot, it wasn't George, it wasn't Mike Grossberg, it was me. I was the one that switched the debate topic on David from the what I thought less interesting strategic question to the more interesting fundamental question. The first time I met David was at an SIL conference. They were holding them in Philadelphia. This was either around the time of the split in Young Americans for Freedom. This was the time that when Roy Childs, before Roy Childs had sported a beard, and before Roy Childs had gotten quite so rotund and was giving his speeches about statism and the rise, a big business and the rise of the American statism. This was the period when Dirk Pearson was going under the name of Sky Dorius and recommending that the best way to spread libertarianism was to give acid to third graders. And the conference that David spoke at, he was quite a sight. He had this, at this time, he had much longer hair than he has now, out quite a bit further. He had this huge medallion, it must have weighed a ton, that he wore around his neck, and I'm not exactly sure what the medallion said. He looked outrageous. He got up to begin his speech, said something to the effect that it was going to be a short speech because he preferred question and answers, they were more fun, and then got up on top of the counter and sat cross-legged and gave his talk. The interesting thing about that talk was that von Mises was in the audience at the same time. And I don't know whether David's appearance or whether what David ended up saying during the talk, but von Mises walked out, much to the disconcert of Don Ernsberger and Dave Walters, who had given that talk. I'm not sure whether it's that one of the two talks I heard at this conference. David was making an economic point, and he started to draw on the board demand and supply diagram. And then he turned to the audience and he said, which axis is demand and which axis is supply? And at the time he says, I've never read any economics books, or I've never taken any economics courses. But it was a good talk anyway on monopoly. And the other talk he gave during that conference was entitled Problems with Libertarianism, 10 years ago. I still have it on tape. So that's the title of David's talk tonight. And I'm hoping that in the intervening 10 years, David has come up with some solutions and some new problems. And we'll find out.
I think, Jeff, somebody should tell you that the two axes on that diagram are called price and quantity, and that supply and demand are both relations between price and quantity. I started arguing libertarianism something well over 20 years ago when I was in high school, and at the time everything seemed very clear and neat. And I made all sorts of great desert island arguments about who had the right to this and that. And a few years later, my best friend in high school, who I spent all of my study halls arguing these things with, told me he'd become a libertarian, which was very satisfactory. And at the time, it seemed to me that the economics was reasonably clear, and if you were only a little bit cleverer, you could prove that government was of no use for anything at all. And over the years, the arguments have seemed to me to grow more and more complicated, and the results less and less clear. And the result is that I find it irritating to discover that a large fraction of the population of libertarians believes that everything is very easy, and that we really know all the answers, and then it starts out with A equals A or some similar axiom, and then with a few simple steps that any intelligent person could see if he only wasn't blinded by his statist preconceptions, we end up with the answer to all problems in the world. I guess another thing that makes me irritated with this is that I have for the last few years been a professional economist, despite the fact that I have never taken for credit an economics course in my life. And I've discovered that there are quite a lot of bright people out there who have thought more about economics than, let us say, 99.8% of libertarians, and don't agree with us about everything, and have good, legitimate reasons for disagreeing with some of our conclusions. So I think the world is a complicated place, and I think it is a good experience for libertarians simply to be told about some problems. So this is essentially the same speech that I gave 10 years ago, and I'm glad somebody still remembers it. The speech will not contain any answers at all. If you come to hear my talk at Denver, you'll get a little fragmentary beginning of an answer to some of the questions, but not very much of one, because they're hard questions. And I think that George should get some credit for having spent the last hour trying to deal with one, count it, one hard question, one which most of us like to ignore because it's too hard. So all I'll be doing is giving you problems. And some of them are going to be problems where, as far as I can see, libertarian ideas as current libertarians understand them give us no answer at all to an important problem. Others are cases where libertarian ideas, as libertarians understand them, seem to give us a perfectly clear answer that none of us is willing to accept or believe in. Others are cases where there seems to be a serious conflict between what the libertarian answer seems to be and other things we believe in or value, and it's not at all clear what the right way of resolving that conflict is. And others are problems with the foundations of our libertarian arguments on which everything else is built. And then after I talk about that, I'll talk a little bit about how to avoid thinking about hard problems. So that really the full title is Hard Problems and How to Avoid Them. I'll start with one of the ones to which I think we don't have any answer, or at least most of us don't, come to Denver. And that's the question of what rights you have against a criminal. Criminal comes into your house and he steals your television set. Now, all libertarians agree you're entitled to take the television set back. Bob Lefebvre would presumably say only very gently. But essentially, all of us agree you can take a television set back. However, it requires a very elementary consideration of the incentives in that situation to realize that if all you ever do is take the television set back, theft is going to be a rather attractive profession, because sometimes you catch the thief and take the television set back, and sometimes you don't catch the thief and don't take the television set back. So heads he wins and tails he breaks even, and that's a pretty good gamble. So that suggests that it might be nice to do something to the thief in addition to taking the television set back. And then the problem is, what? How much are you entitled to do? I think very few of us feel that if you steal a nickel from me, I'm entitled to enslave you for the rest of your life. And yet, short of that, how in principle do we decide what the appropriate punishment is? Now, some people would say, well, that's very easy. The appropriate punishment is whatever is necessary to deter thieves. But of course, an economist will tell you that that sort of all or nothing category isn't very useful. The higher the punishment is, the more thieves will be deterred, the less time and trouble you have to take guarding your property, and so forth. Now, other people think that you can get the answer by waving your hands. 10 years ago, as Jeff may remember, a member of the audience who was a disciple of one of the more prominent libertarian thinkers came up and said, oh, that's an easy problem. Murray solved that years ago. you get to punish him with exactly the amount of what he's taken. If he takes $100 from you, you take $100 and then another $100 back. To which my answer is, well, 2 is a nice number. I mean, so is 3, so is 1.5. I mean, saying that you can invent an answer doesn't give me any reason to believe it. Besides, what if you only catch 1/10 of the thieves? If you only catch 1/10 of the thieves, then stealing $100 with 1 chance in 10 of having to give 200 back is still a pretty good deal. So that's one example of what seems to me as a hard and interesting problem. If you like, you can think of it as either a moral problem or an economic problem. But it's a problem in rights. Simply, when somebody violates somebody else's rights, what claim does the victim have? And please remember, or maybe it'll become clearer as I go on, that violation of rights is not merely something done by terrible, evil, wicked people. It's something that any of us might do by mistake, that any of us might do when we believe the circumstances are one thing and they're another. And the same question then arises. You might say, of course, that if I've only violated your rights by mistake, then all you have to do is take the television set back. It was just, I made a mistake. I thought it was my television set. But of course, an economist will tell you that how much trouble I go to avoid making mistakes may have something to do with whether or not I receive some punishment when I make them. Well, let me give you another problem in the same general ballpark. And this problem is best illustrated by a simple story. It was a story apparently on television about a man who was sitting at home waiting to hear who had been stealing his firewood. Now, the rest of the story goes as follows. That's the punchline. The rest of the story was that he had a pile of firewood, and it had been disappearing, and he'd tried keeping an eye out for whoever was stealing it and didn't manage to catch the guy, and maybe he put a fence around it or something, and that didn't work. So eventually he decided on a rather simple and elegant solution to the problem. He took a stick of firewood, and he drilled a hole in it, and he put a stick of dynamite in the hole. And he put the stick of firewood back on his wood pile, and the next day it disappeared. And then he sat at home waiting to hear who had been stealing his firewood. Now, it's a very clever solution, but some of us may feel that capital punishment is a little bit extreme for petty theft. And that raises, again, the same sort of questions. Given that you're entitled to defend your rights, just what are you entitled to do to defend your rights? Are you entitled to machine gun people for trespassing on your lawn, for example? Well, most of us would say no. Are you not entitled to hurt people at all? Well, that would seem to leave you pretty nearly defenseless. What are you entitled to do? How do you find out? Do you just sort of wave your hands and say, well, I can invent an answer. I'm entitled to do as much damage to him as he was going to do to me? Well, in that case, the dynamite is out, but so are practically any serious defense is eliminated by that method. So that's a second problem for you to think about in my list of problems. Let me give you a third one which is related to this. It's an old sort of puzzle for people who like to argue moral arguments, but it's also one of some current relevance. It's what's usually called the human shield problem. The bad guy grabs up an innocent victim, pulls out a gun, points it at you, and starts shooting or asking for your money or whatever. You have a gun, but if you shoot back, you might kill the innocent shield. Are you entitled to do it? Now, instead of elaborating on that problem, I would like to suggest that there is a form of that problem which is closely involved with arguments about foreign policy, and in particular about nuclear deterrence. That is to say, suppose it is the case that there is no practical way of preventing somebody from blowing you up with nuclear weapons except by threatening to blow him up. Now, maybe it's not the case, but I don't see anything in the nature of reality that makes it impossible that it should be the case. So let's think about that hypothesis. And just to make things simple, let's suppose that the somebody who wants to blow you up is the government of the Soviet Union, and you are an American citizen who's a libertarian and wants to do the right thing. And let's suppose, to avoid a bunch of irrelevant issues, that we don't have an American government. We've got a private protection agency in America. It's financed by voluntary contributions. And the question is, should it use these contributions to buy nuclear missiles and aim them at Moscow? And I will suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is not a viable alternative. That is to say, if the Russians come and fight you in the streets, they will win because they will blow up with their nuclear weapons anything that they want to, and they will use that as a threat to make all the Americans turn against you because they don't want to be blown up and so forth and so on. I don't want to get into a long thing on foreign policy. I just want to set up my hypothetical case. And now somebody points out to you that if you have nuclear missiles aimed at Moscow, and if you ever use them, you are going to be killing a couple of million Russian civilians who are totally innocent, who are far more victims of the Soviet government than you are at the moment, and who merely have the misfortune to live next to where the Soviet rulers live. And if you use your nuclear missiles to blow up Russian missile silos, that radiation will kill another 100,000 innocent Russian civilians who are in no way responsible for the aggression of their government, even if we suppose their government is going to commit aggression. And you are then left with the interesting problem. Do you say, I'm sorry about it, but I've got to defend my freedom. The only way to do it is by using these missiles. And therefore, if necessary, I hope it won't come to it, but if necessary, I will kill the human shields. I will blow up Moscow just if that's the only way of defending myself. Or do you say, no, that's an immoral act. You should never, the ends never justify the means. Those individuals have a right not to be aggressed against. Unfortunately, that means we have to surrender to the Soviet Union. Unpleasant choice. I can't say I like either alternative. For anybody who does like the alternative, maybe I should expand a bit on why they shouldn't like whichever alternative they think they like. Maybe, I suppose, the alternative of surrendering to the Soviets maybe is obviously unattractive. But let's suppose you say, well, it's all right. I don't like the idea of killing these people, but it is a human shield problem, and it's the only way I can defend myself, and I'm not, after all, trying to aggress against them. They just happen to be getting in the line of fire, so to speak, so it's all right. Well, then the next question I ask is, if you're entitled to violate other people's rights in defending yourself, if that's the only way of doing it, suppose you're fighting a tank war, and there's somebody with a farm in the way, and that person, for his own reasons, says, sorry, I know that you would like to move your army across my land. In fact, you have to do that in order to stop the bad guys over there, but I don't give you permission. Now, it happens the bad guys aren't libertarians, so they don't have to worry about this problem. So they can maneuver their army wherever they like, but you keep on being stopped every time you run into a no trespassing sign, so you lose the war. All right? So that convinces you even more clearly that these human shields have to be pushed out of the way. But let's keep going, because suppose somebody tells you, look, in order to defend the U.S., we need taxes. Now, it's true that collecting taxes may seem to violate the rights of the other American citizens who are sharing North America with you. But if it's the only way of defending your rights, well, we've already established that it's all right to blow people up with nuclear bombs if they're in your way when you're trying to defend your rights. And taking 1,000 or 2 a year from your fellow citizens is much less serious than blowing people up with nuclear bombs. So that's all right. Now, let us suppose, just to be hypothetical, that somebody argued persuasively, as in some circumstances you can argue persuasively, that a draft is a very important and necessary thing for national defense. Now, of course, you wouldn't want to violate the rights of those people you were drafting, but if it's the only way of defending your rights... Now, my point in raising these things is not to say, therefore, we should have a draft. It is to make you a little less sure that the arguments you use against people who want a draft or who want taxation or who want whatever it is are all that absolutely clear and cut and dry. I have a feeling that a lot of your confidence comes from the fact that you believe, as I believe, that we don't face this problem. That you believe, as I believe, that in fact the U.S. can be defended without a draft. But think about the problem. Suppose you believed the contrary. Suppose you really had to face the choice, do I aggress against other people, or do I surrender to a totalitarian dictatorship? Then you have a hard problem. Anyway, I'll leave you with that and go on to the next. So far I've been talking about areas where it seems to me that libertarian theory doesn't give us a very clear answer. Now let me talk about a subject I raised briefly last night, namely areas where it seems to me that libertarian theory, as most of us understand it, does give us a clear answer, unfortunately. And I'll take a particular part of libertarian theory, and that's the idea of absolute property rights. that almost all of us believe in absolute property rights. We feel that I own something, it's mine. You're not entitled to say to me, well, you don't really need it, so I'll take it. You're not entitled to say to me, well, I'll take it and pay you fair compensation. Most of us feel that trespassing should be forbidden, not merely punished. Punished only if you happen to have been unsuccessful in forbidding it. And one of the arguments we often use for that is the argument which says that there is no way of finding out how valuable something is to somebody other than his willingness to sell it. So that if I have a piece of land and the government wants to use it to build a highway on, the argument goes, if the government can get me to sell it to them, or whoever else is building the road can get me to sell it to them, that's fine. That demonstrates that it's worth more to them than to me. But on the other hand, if I'm not willing to sell, the argument goes, there's no way they can find out how much it's worth to me. There's no way of judging values externally from somebody. And therefore, you just have to accept my judgment that it's more valuable to me. It's my property. Very popular argument. We probably, all of us who do much arguing have made it from time to time. We now come to my trespassing photons raised last night. I have a piece of property, and you have a piece of property 5 miles away, and I inform you that you do not have my permission to turn on your lights. And you say, well, why do I need your permission to turn on my lights? And I say, well, you know, I've got that piece of property. I don't live there. I don't use any lights there. I just own it. And every time you turn on your lights, some of that light gets onto my property. I could demonstrate with a telescope and a camera that some photons from your light bulb are straying onto my property. And you say, yeah, but they're not doing any damage, are they? And I say, damage? That's for me to decide. There's no way of determining how much I value not having photons on my property except by what I say. After all, the argument that all you libertarians are all used to using for absolute property rights is that it's not a matter of whether it does damage or not. It belongs to me, and I get to decide what does damage. I get to decide how my land is used. Just as most of us would say most of the time, you can't trespass across my land and then explain that you didn't harm anything. I get to say, no, you don't get on, it's my land. So I should be able to say the same thing to photons. And of course, it's not just photons. When you breathe, you exhale carbon dioxide. Now, it just so happens that I don't like having carbon dioxide straying on my land. Now, I don't mind your breathing in. Now, I should say that there might be a very practical reason for my taking this position. Because, of course, as a reasonable man, I would be willing to sell you the right to breathe out. So we seem to be in a position where the arguments that we're fond of using in other contexts lead to the conclusion that you cannot breathe out without permission from every landowner on the planet. Maybe the continent. That's not a conclusion that any of us believe in or like, and yet it would seem to follow from the kind of arguments that we think are nice, clear, watertight arguments when they lead to places that we want to go. I'll give you another one of the same sort. The same situation, except instead of a small effect, make it a small probability of an effect. Most of us would say that I am not entitled to smash your window, even if I'm willing to pay for it. Am I entitled to fly an airplane? When I take off in my airplane, I know there is some very small probability that I'll crash. There's a very small probability that I will first depart from my flight plan unintentionally and go 200 miles in the wrong direction, and then crash. I am inflicting, without permission, a risk of injury on everybody within 200 miles of the airport I take off from. I'm assuming an airplane with a cruising range of only 200 miles, which is modest. Does that mean I can't take off? Does it mean I can take no action at all, which inflicts any risk on anybody else? Now, you may say, oh, but that's not the same thing as deliberately throwing a ball through someone's window. And I say, well, I don't see the difference. It's true in one case I'm certain of the consequence, in the other I'm not. But in each case, I am getting a benefit, being able to fly from here to New Orleans or whatever, at a cost to you. I am forcibly imposing on you a rather small chance of having an airplane fall through your roof. I'm doing that without your permission. I am aggressing against you. And why is there a fundamental moral difference between aggressing against you with 90% chance of it turning out and aggressing against you with 0.0001% chance of it turning out. Isn't the principle the same? And as we are representatives of the party of principle, shouldn't we immediately enjoin all airport flights? I should say I was reminded a bit of this when I heard John Goffman arguing with regard to nuclear power, that it didn't really matter how much radiation reactors put out. Any radiation at all was trespass. Any radiation at all was the initiation of coercion. And therefore, as libertarians, we had to be opposed to reactors. And I was a little disturbed when later on in the same speech, in the question period, somebody asked him if it wasn't true that burning coal created more radiation than nuclear plants when you allow for this and that. And he said, no, that wasn't true. That wasn't true. That coal created substantially less radiation than nuclear plants. And it didn't seem to occur to him that the question of whether it was more or less was irrelevant if he really believed what he had just been saying 20 minutes before. And that indeed, if he really believed that, there was a strong case for saying that he had to stop breathing. All right, so that gives you a second category of problems to worry about. George got disturbed some time ago by my using the term catastrophic for these problems. He apparently believed I meant that these problems posed a catastrophic threat to moral philosophy, which was, of course, a very threatening thing to say to George. I didn't mean that at all. I just meant that I thought not being allowed to breathe out was sort of a serious problem. Let me now go on to some problems with the foundations of the libertarian argument. And the foundations of the libertarian argument, at least as it's stated, have a good deal to do with property. In particular, when I forbid you to let those photons trespass, that's because I claim that I own this piece of land. And the business about flying the airplane has something to do with crashing onto your property, though also crashing into you could be a problem. Where do we get all this property? Well, the libertarians say that's easy. We get property by creating things. We take the primal stuff of the universe and mold it with our hands. Yeah, but there's only a certain amount of that primal stuff, and the kind called land we didn't create. It was just there. All right? So it turns out that one of the most important kinds of property in land, cannot be justified on what we all sort of intuitively feel is the ultimate justification for property rights, namely I own myself and my labor, and that which proceeds from my labor is mine. The land doesn't proceed from your labor. So we cook up all sorts of stories about you mixed your labor with the land, or you were the first guy to draw a boundary around it, or you were the first guy to look down and say, mine, or somehow or other you got it. I don't mind sort of telling pretty stories. They're better than not doing anything at all. However, I'd like to point out that if you're going to claim strong moral conclusions, you would better have something more than a story that could be told in any of 73 different ways, because those different ways might lead to different conclusions. You might discover that according to some of the theories of initial acquisition of property rights, your house wasn't yours. It belonged to somebody else, and that you were the trespasser. Let me expand a little more on that. Aside from the first problem of how we get to own land, there is a second problem, and that is that a very large part of the land in the world is stolen property, probably most of it. Let's take England, perhaps, as a clearer case than the US. In the case of England, presumably most of the more attractive pieces of real estate were settled by 1066. In 1066, there was a rather abrupt readjustment of property titles. Similar readjustments occurred from time to time during the next 900 years. Now, you are sitting in your house in England, which you have, let us suppose, as a good American tourist rented from some Englishman, and a guy breaks in the door, and you pull out your gun because you're an American and you know how to defend yourself and you're a libertarian, and you say, you're violating my property rights. And he says, really? Why is this property yours? And you say, oh, I rented it. And he said, well, who did you rent it for? And I said, oh, Mr. Smith, the guy who owns it. And he said, well, why does he own it? He said, oh, he bought it from somebody who owned it. Well, how did he get it? Well, you trace it back about 15 times. Oh, he got it from somebody who stole it. Well, I think you ought to worry about it a little bit. Now, if we get to America, we get into the question of whether you should give the land back to the Indians, and that's an interesting question, but I've got enough other problems to deal with, so I'll skip that one for the moment. But I do want to make the point of why it matters. We're claiming rights. Most of us would claim that when the thief breaks into your house, if there's no other way of dealing with him, you're entitled to shoot him. you're certainly entitled to hit him over the head. Well, I could think of some very plausible versions of a libertarian definition of property rights, derivation of property rights, in which you're not. After all, I say to the thief, look, the reason this land is mine is that I put value into it. I, or the guy I bought it from, cleared the trees and built the house and so forth. And the thief says, he's actually not a thief, at least I don't know if he's a thief. He says, look, you're perfectly right. I am not entitled to use your roof to keep the rain off of. And I'm not entitled to use your land to grow grain on, because those are all things which are the result of your labor, and your labor belongs to you. But at the moment, all I'm using this land to do is to walk across. Now, it's true I'm walking on your floor, but I'd much rather the floor weren't there, because then I wouldn't have had to climb up the steps. So that insofar as your labor has done anything, to me, it has simply made things a little more inconvenient for me. All I'm doing is taking a shortcut across your land. I could have done that before you cleared the forest, before you built the house. Therefore, the use I'm making of that property does not owe a single thing to your labor. And what are you doing pointing that gun at me? Well, I would suggest that if you believe you're entitled to point a gun at a thief, even if the thief won't be a libertarian moral philosopher and therefore won't make all these arguments, you ought to think about whether you really have a firm foundation for your belief that you own that house, or the land, or anything else other than yourself, which most of us feel comfortable with. Though we could make arguments about that too, but let's not. Let me go on to another fairly broad category, and it's one which economists are very concerned about and other libertarians don't seem to worry about very much. It's what's called the public good problem. The importance of the public good problem is that, as a rule, economists in general and libertarian economists in particular believe that there are strong arguments for saying that if something is desirable, then under a free market it'll happen. If I value automobiles, somebody will build me an automobile. If I value food, someone will grow food. And we therefore feel comfortable saying we just have an unhindered free market, no government intervention, we'll have a good, well-functioning society, we won't starve to death, we won't go naked for no clothes being made, and so forth. And the public good problem involves a particular special sort of good for which the normal arguments that lead to this conclusion don't hold. What's a public good? A public good does not mean a good that is produced by government. There are lots of public goods that are produced privately, and there are lots of private goods that are produced by government. Now, I should say, economists use slightly different definitions among themselves. So I'll give you the version I use. It won't be quite identical to what Samuelson would use. A public good is a good such that if it is produced, it will become available to the members of a pre-existing group of people. Or in other words, it is a good such that the producer cannot control who gets it. I don't mean shouldn't control, I mean can't control. And I can give you a very simple example, starting with a public good that happens to be provided privately, and that's a radio broadcast. Normally, when we produce goods, we can say to individuals, if you want it, pay for it. If you don't pay for it, you don't get it. If I make a radio broadcast, it is impractical, or at least has been impractical up to very recently, for me to control who hears it. And therefore, I have to find some other way of selling it. Now, that's a particularly interesting case because there turns out to be a very, very clever market solution to providing that public good, which would never have occurred to me, I think, if I had had to dream it up. And that is you combine a public good which has a positive value to the customers and a positive cost of production with another public good which has a negative value to the customers and a negative cost of production, namely advertisements. You tie them together in a package, and that's how you pay for it. However, that is, so to speak, an ad hoc solution. It works in that particular case. Another public good, and one which I think libertarians should be more seriously worried about, is national defense. I should say, for those people who say we don't need a national defense because once we abolish the government we won't have a nation anymore, my definition of national defense is defense against nations. And that problem is going to exist after we get rid of ours. Now, it so happens that there are serious technical difficulties when a nuclear warhead is going through space en route from Moscow to here, finding out whose name is on it. There is not any very good way of saying A, B, and C have paid for protection. So therefore, all warheads aimed at them will get shot down. And D, E, and F, where their neighbors haven't, and therefore warheads aimed at them will let go by. Due to the difficulties in this, national defense is a public good. Now, I do not want to assert that public goods can't be produced on the market. On the contrary, there are quite a number of ways they can be. What I do assert, however, is that the strong arguments which make us confident that something which is worth producing will be produced do not hold for public goods. That is to say, with regard to an ordinary private good, one can say with some confidence, if it's worth producing, it'll be produced. With a public good, you can only say, maybe. All right, let us suppose then that there exists some particular public good where you are convinced that the answer to the maybe is no. Let us suppose, to take what I think is the most serious problem for libertarians, that national defense is such a public good. That is, suppose that it can't be provided except by using the government to steal money from your fellow citizens and use that to pay for defense. Now, the assertion I would make as an economist is we have no grounds for being confident that that hypothetical can't occur. We have no grounds for being confident that we can defend ourselves without government. We may have grounds for thinking we can do so. It may be worth doing a lot of thinking about that. I devote a chapter of my book to that subject. But we don't have grounds for being confident that we can do it. So then I ask you, as libertarians, suppose you can't. Suppose you can't. Is the proper solution to say, well, it's too bad, we can't defend ourselves by moral means, we're moral people, we'll send the surrender notice to the Soviets tomorrow? Or is the appropriate answer to say, we regret doing this, friends, but we've just become the IRS, fork over your money so we can pay for national defense? Now, as I say, I'm not offering answers today, I'm only offering problems, so I'll let you stew in that one for a while. While I go on to what's the part of this talk you've really been wanting to hear, you should be wanting to hear by now, which is how to avoid thinking about hard problems. Now, there are a number of ways of avoiding thinking about hard problems which I have observed to be useful as I've passed through libertarian society over the last 20 years. One of the most common ones is to assume or argue that the facts that create the problem don't exist. Thus, if I offer the problem I just offered, some people will say, oh, no, we don't have to worry about that problem. The Soviets have no interest at all in attacking the US. They are purely defensive people. The only reason that they have all those thousands and thousands of tanks is they're afraid we're going to invade them, and therefore, no problem. Now, one answer could be for me to get sucked into an argument about the Soviet intentions, but I'm not terribly interested in that at the moment. The right answer for me to make is, maybe you're right. Maybe the Soviets have no such intention, but suppose they did. All right? If the reason that you're opposed to taxing people is that you happen to believe the Soviets are pussycats, then when you object to taxes, you ought to say, I'm against taxes because the Soviets are pussycats, we don't need them. If the reason you're against taxing people is because you're a party of principle and taxation is bad, taxation is theft, then you ought to be willing to say, even if the Soviets aren't pussycats, even if I accept all of these unpleasant hypotheses, I'm still not willing to tax you. Well, maybe you're willing to say that. If you are, think about it for an hour and then say it. I'm not saying that I have an answer to this question. I'm only saying that I think the quick and easy answers are easy ones to make in a debating context, but hard ones to live with. All right, so one solution is to deny the facts. Now, there is a solution which looks like this but isn't quite the same. And that is to say not merely that the facts don't happen to be that way, but that there's some logical reason why they can't be that way. That is, a lot of libertarians are under the delusion that there exists somewhere buried in human action or capitalism, the unknown ideal, or somewhere, a proof that the free market always solves all problems. And, I'm sorry, maybe it's there. I haven't found it. Lots of economists who are basically pro-free market have looked real hard for it. And I don't think any of them have found it. Von Mises didn't find it. Von Mises was in favor of the draft. I can show you where in human action he comes out in favor of the draft. Adam Smith didn't find it. Adam Smith was in favor of the Navigation Acts, which were acts which essentially limited English commerce to English ships. And the reason he was in favor of them was not for economic reasons. He thought they were bad as far as England's welfare was concerned, but because in case of a war with the Dutch, he wanted there to be lots of trained English sailors who would be willing to fight, and it didn't do any good if they were all Dutch sailors. So that, this hidden answer isn't there, I'm afraid. All right, so one way of avoiding these problems is to say, well, the facts aren't the way you say, and therefore I don't have to think about the hard problem. Another way, popular with certain segments of the libertarian society, is to call these lifeboat problems, and to say that since we don't live in lifeboats, we don't have to think about lifeboat problems. Now, I guess my answer to that problem is first that whether or not we live in a lifeboat is an empirical question. A lot of people think we live in a spaceship, after all. That if, suppose it turns out we do live in a lifeboat, then what do you do? Or more generally, if you claim you have a system of ethics which tells you how to act, one of the things it ought to tell you how to do is what to do in a lifeboat. For those of you who are not sort of members of the running argument on this that's been going on for the last 20 years, a lifeboat situation means you and 8 other people are in a lifeboat adrift on the Pacific Ocean. There's only a certain amount of food. You have a gun. Are you entitled to shoot some of the other people so there'll be enough food for the rest of you? Does it depend who the lifeboat belongs to? Does it depend who the gun belongs to? What if someone's trying to crawl in and he'll upset? I mean, there are a whole bunch of these problems. But they're all problems that you have very, very few alternatives. It's life or death, and it looks like violating what you would normally describe as people's rights is the only way to live. Now, I've sometimes suspected that what's really going on in the sort of objectivist inner circle is that they all believe that when you're in a lifeboat situation, you do whatever is necessary to stay alive, but they'd much rather not tell the rest of us that, because we might be in a lifeboat with them someday. One can expand that argument a little bit further. One of the problems with the objectivist derivation of ethics, as I understand it, is the person who says, yes, I agree, most of the time I should respect rights, but once in a while I get a really good chance to steal, and it serves my life qua life to steal under those circumstances. And once in a while I get this sneaking suspicion that there is something that Ayn Rand isn't telling us, because it's perfectly clear that it's in your rational self-interest to tell other people to respect rights all the time. All right, so calling it a lifeboat situation and saying that ethics doesn't have to deal with lifeboat situations is a second way of avoiding such things. A third way of avoiding such things is to say, oh, that's the old is-ought dichotomy, and we know that there aren't any is-ought dichotomies. Well, again, why? Why aren't there? Well, I can think of 2 reasons. One of them is that is always gives you an ought. Or in other words, if in order to serve your life, which consists of being willing to blow up Moscow in order to keep the Russians from conquering you, if in order to do that you've got to murder a bunch of innocent Russians, then you ought to. Well, all right, if that's your view of ethics, fine, but in that case I wish you'd stop using all this ethical talk to hide the proposition that you ought to do whatever serves your rational self-interest. Another possibility is that you really believe there are no is-ought problems, because ultimately, as George said last night, and as I agreed, you can't get oughts from is's. Therefore, no proposition about what is can ever give you a should. Or in other words, the statement that it is impossible to defend your liberty without violating the liberties of innocent Russian civilians doesn't tell you that you should violate those liberties, which is perfectly true. In other words, you come up with the conclusion that you do what you ought to do, though the skies fall. Fiat justitia ruet coelum, as they used to say in Latin, let justice be done though the skies fall. And I've noticed that there are very few people saying that who really believe the sky is going to fall when they do justice. And maybe there are a few, and if so, then they are honorable people. That's a legitimate position, I think, to hold. But it's one which most of us are reluctant to hold. And I think there is a certain element of hypocrisy when you say to somebody who disagrees with you, I believe in fiat justitium ruet coelum, and therefore you're immoral for being in favor of doing this. By the way, the skies aren't going to fall when you do the moral thing. That's pretending a kind of a moral superiority you don't really have. All right, well, I think I've talked enough about problems, and as Jeff remembered from the last time, I have this general doctrine that when you're answering a question, you're reasonably sure at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. So I will close by telling you what is actually probably the best way of avoiding dealing with these problems, and the one you will find most useful if you don't want to feel upset with the purity of your ideas, and that is when any of these subjects comes up, change the subject.
I have an important announcement about a schedule change. So first, right now we're having an hour break. If you want to panel discussion or debate, you can decide.
Yep. Yep. I think abortion is a very hard problem. I am not sure that I regard it as a hard libertarian problem. That is to say, I think that the essential issues of what is or is not a human being, although they are important and interesting issues for libertarians, are just as much issues for everybody else. And therefore, I guess my answer is it's a hard problem, and I deliberately left it out on the grounds that I was trying to talk specifically about what I thought were problems for libertarians within the context of libertarian ideas. I think sort of my view of the debate is that among libertarians, each side has succeeded in convincing itself that it's clear that libertarianism implies you either should or should not allow abortion, and no one has done at all a good job of convincing anybody else. Yep.
What about space migration?
What about what?
Space migration?
What about space migration? Why is that a problem?
It's not on our platform, is it?
I'm in favor of people yes, it is. There is the Libra film. We say not on our platform. What would you have in our platform about space migration? I mean, we don't have anything in our platform about exploring the seas or inventing new computers or any of the lots of things that are hopefully going to happen in the next century. But anyway, yeah?
There's one small solution to your first problem is to have a sliding scale payback on theft. If you have 10, let's say the statistics are 10 thefts, only one gets reported, the guy that gets reported and convicted pays 10 times the rest. As theft goes up, the price goes up. As theft goes down, and so forth.
That is certainly an interesting idea. There are a couple of difficulties with it, I think. The idea, for those people who couldn't hear it clearly, was that the appropriate way of deciding on the punishment for a crime was to say that if you catch 10% of the people who steal television sets, that the penalty then consists of 10 times the value of a television set. Is that a fair summary? No. Yeah.
Not on the value of the television set, but on the number of arrests and convictions.
I said 10 times the value. I said if you catch 1/10 of the people who steal, then the penalty is 10 times the value of what the person stole.
Correct. Yeah, gotcha.
That's what you said. That's what I thought. Now, I would point out two things. One of them is that some people might argue that you are then punishing the guy you caught for the offense of the guy you didn't catch, and that's rather unfair. Second, I would point out that how many people you catch is not a thing given from above. It's a function of how much money you're willing to spend trying to catch them. And are you willing to say, for example, that if you deliberately decide on the following policy. You say that in order to save money on police, we will go to very little trouble to catch criminals. The result is we'll only catch one criminal in 10,000. And when we catch him, we will boil him in oil, that being a penalty equivalent to 10,000 times the value of a television set. That seems rather unsatisfactory. And yet, if you don't say that, how do you decide how much you do or don't have to spend in catching criminals, which is itself going to determine the probabilities, which will itself determine the level of the punishment? Now, I don't want to say that your suggestion is not in the right direction. but only that I think it is an immensely more complicated problem than that answer suggests. It is one of the things that I may be talking about in Denver. Next.
Regarding your reference to national defense as a public good, couldn't and wouldn't people voluntarily pool their money for a cause they support, such as national defense?
The problem with that, and the general public good problem, is if something is worth $1,000 to me, and if spending $1,000 I get it and not spending $1,000 I don't, then I will surely spend $1,000. However, suppose we have something which is worth $1,000 to me, but whether or not I spend $1,000 has only a very tiny effect on whether I get it, which is the case with national defense. If we're trying to raise by charity a budget of $10 billion, I say my 1,000 is a drop in the bucket. If they get enough to pay for the missiles, I'm going to be defended whether or not I spend money on it. If they don't, I'm throwing my money away, so why bother? Let me repeat the argument in a slightly different form. There are surely at least 100,000 people in the U.S. who are basically libertarian. Probably more than that, say 100,000. And I would guess that on the average, those people believe that having a free society for themselves and their children is worth quite a lot more than $1,000 each. Your argument seems to imply that Ed Clark could raise $100 million. That is to say that if there are 100,000 people, each of whom values it at $1,000, that you ought to be able to get $100 million for some program which has a reasonable probability of bringing freedom. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but you can see the logic of the argument, which is that it's one thing to go to somebody with a car and say, look, you value this car, if you give me the money, you get the car. It's a very different thing to go to him and say, here is something, whether you get it has almost nothing to do with what you do, why don't you give me some money for it? And that's the problem with public goods in general. That's why they're a hard problem.
Well, David, I found your talk stimulating. I was going to ask a question or pose a question that was pretty much the same as the lady just asked. I think you create a false problem with your talking about provision of defense as a public good. Suppose we have an anarchist society, and you're saying suppose Russia, poses a real threat to the people in the United States, not to the government, because there's no government. Okay, you're saying, well, we look around and we say, gee, this is a real problem, and I don't want Russia ruling me, so I'm going to create a government here, and we're going to tax everybody, and that way we're going to pay for adequate defense. Well, no, I think that betrays little understanding of state dynamics. First of all, if you had enough consensus in your society to create an IRS, you wouldn't need to create an IRS to get the money anyway. I mean, I really don't think you would. And second of all, I don't understand why you prefer being ruled by, okay, it's obvious you have a preference to be ruled by one set of rulers as opposed to another set of rulers, but I don't know what gives you that confidence that one set of rulers will ever turn out to be better than another.
Well, on the second question, we have a bit of evidence, and I'd like, I run into from time to time the people who say, well, after all, one government's just like another government, so I want to ask you a very simple question. Suppose I was somehow able to believably offer you the following gamble. We flip a coin. If it turns up heads, you spend the rest of your life in Russia as it now is, as an average Russian. If it turns up tails, you spend the rest of your life in the kind of libertarian America you'd like to live in. Or alternatively, you don't have to flip the coin. You can go ahead with the way things are now. Mm-hmm. Would you take the coin flip?
Would I take the coin flip?
On those odds.
No, I'd bet that I could do my best to change it.
But you would not accept that flip.
Would I not?
If you're saying you wouldn't accept the coin flip, then you have just told me that the difference between America as it now is in the Soviet Union is greater than the difference between America as it now is in a free society.
Right, but you're putting me in the position of being a hypothetical Russian, so I'm already different.
No, I'm saying right now, you're standing here, and
okay.
I say, I offer you the following gamble. I'm a magician somehow, and I can make you believe it's real. All right? Either you live your life as you're now going to live it, or we flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, you are instantly transported to the Soviet Union. We'll let you speak Russian and things like that. So, if it comes up tails, we have a libertarian revolution, and you live the rest of your life in the kind of libertarian society you want. Would you accept that gamble?
Well, what I told you before is I wouldn't, and you said that
You
betrays something, but what I'm trying to tell you is that it's not so much what Soviet leaders want to do. In other words, I have no faith in Reagan's intentions and what he wants to do, because I believe he wants to get away with as much as he can get away with. What I put my faith in is the American people and how much they're willing to put up with. Now, they're willing to put up with far too much, for my taste. But however, it seems that the Soviet people are willing to put up with a little more. And that's the crucial difference, not the leadership.
So the assertion you're making is that if the Soviet government conquered the U.S. would stay about as free as it was before the Soviet government conquered it. We've got a little bit of experimental evidence on this proposition. Would you say, for example, that East Germany and West Germany, which have, I presume that East Germans and West Germans have more or less identical willingnesses to put up with things. They were one country 40 years ago. Would you say that East Germany and West Germany are about equally free at the moment?
David, no, I wouldn't, but I think I should be fair and let other people speak, and we can talk about this later.
All right, but
okay? I mean, we can pursue it at length, but
I would suggest that East Germany and West Germany are very strong evidence that the thesis you want to offer, which is how much people get oppressed only depends on what they'll put up with, is false. Next.
We'll talk about it later.
Yep.
It was a rather interesting talk, and you presented all these problems, and you came to the end with this, what do we do, what happens now, well, we got all these problems to worry about, and you say ignore them. Now, how is ignoring them a solution? How is ignoring a problem a solution? And do you think these problems will be solved? And how, with all these problems, do you accept the Libertarian Party?
You remind me of the story about the preacher who preached on the text, "The fool saith in his heart there is no God." And at the end of the sermon, one of his parishioners came up to him and said, "You know, it was a pretty good sermon, preacher, but I still think there might be a God." I didn't, in suggesting ways of avoiding thinking about problems, I didn't mean to recommend that that was what you should do. I meant to suggest that that was what you shouldn't do, and that's what people very frequently do. So that I'm certainly not suggesting that you should fail to think about such problems. The answer to how I can still be a libertarian is that I know of no set of ideas or conclusions that I like more, that I believe the world is a complicated place, that there aren't always simple, straightforward, easy answers to things, and that it seems to me that in general the libertarian answers to most questions appeal to me more than do those of any alternative ideology I've come across. So I think you have to live with the fact that you may not have a simple, straightforward, axiomatic system, that you may make some mistakes, and so forth. And that's not a reason for not being a libertarian, but it is a reason for not being a libertarian who thinks that all non-libertarians are knaves or fools. And that's the attitude I was attempting to attack. Next.
I'm curious as to why you didn't address the question of adopting property rights for new resources that previously had no value. I'm thinking in terms of mining the ocean floor and exploration of space.
That's an interesting question, and I guess the only reason was that I had enough other things to talk about. But I would agree that is an interesting question. In particular, I'll give you one form of it that people have thought about a little bit, and that is that I think most libertarians would agree that it is desirable to convert the airwaves into private property. Now, there's a perfectly simple way of doing that, practically, and that is to have the government auction them off, and whoever buys them owns them. However, from a moral standpoint, the obvious reply is, but if the government didn't own them in the first place, how can they sell them? And therefore, after I have bought them in the government auction, when you then start broadcasting on my frequency, what right do I have to stop you? So that is a case of a new property, of a new kind of property that came into existence in the last century, where it is by no means clear how you establish who is the legitimate owner. And yet it's clear that somebody ought to own it. From an economic standpoint, it would be very desirable to have them property. Next.
First of all,
I think there are few enough of us that this business of your standing over there and my standing over here and yelling at each other is getting silly. So everybody who wants to talk, come over to this corner of the thing and we'll forget about the microphones.